appreciate the speaker today is our very own Preston Stovall, who really addresses the topic of our project with a talk entitled Normative Attitudes, Political Intentions, and Brandomian Inferentialism.
So thank you, Alonso, and thanks everybody for coming in the morning. I gave myself a 9:30 slot, thinking this would be the best way to handle it, and then I was mostly responsible last night, I think. So I feel like I'm ready. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about where I'm at. I came here thinking that in the first year I would work on a semantic for collective intentions that comes out of work that Alan Gibbard did in the 90s and 2000s, but that was, I came to find, rooted in things that Sellers suggested in the 60s and 70s. And my hope was that if I got that squared away in the first year, that in the second year then I could apply that semantics to give an account of the normative attitudes that on Brandom's account of inferentialism underlie linguistic meaning. And I think I'm there. So I think, knock on wood, part of the board, there's wood in there somewhere. I think I'm exactly where I want to be in terms of where I wanted to be a year ago. So this is laying out the semantics. That's what I'll do for the first maybe 15 minutes or so. And then what I'm going to do after that, and most of the PowerPoint then will be just laying out the details of the semantics. But that's all in the handout. So there won't be anything on the PowerPoint with the exception of a couple of quotations that aren't in the handout. And then the rest of the PowerPoint is going to be just showing some diagrams, because my attempt to motivate this reading of collective intentions as an analysis of normative attitudes will be by way of Brandom's meaning use diagrams in between saying and doing. So the PowerPoint then, with the exception of the stuff at the beginning, is primarily just to show some of those diagrams, but those are also in the handout too. Okay, so So where are the norms? This is one of these things that gets asked a lot. If norms are supposed to make sense of meaning, where are the norms? What are these normative statuses that are supposed to underlie meaning? Now, according to Brandom's inferentialism, linguistic meaning is at least partly determined or explained by inferential role, while inferential role is at least partly determined or explained in terms of normative statuses like commitment, entitlement, and incompatibility. And I think we should see this as part of a broader project in semantics that has roots in philosophical logic in the 20th century, but that ultimately goes back to debates from at least the Middle Ages about different kinds of meaning. Because really what's at stake here, I think, is something like a contrast between meaning understood representationally or model theoretically in terms of word-world relations or mind-world relations, and meaning understood proof theoretically in terms of word-word relations, or how to use certain things. So in proof theory, we give meaning in terms of introduction, elimination, rules. The idea is that you can then specify what a sentence or a lexical item means in terms of its use in a derivation. And then, as I say, I think this actually has roots in prior to 20th century logic in debates between extension and comprehension that show up in the Middle Ages for the same kind of things that Hradec needs to use sense in addition to reference to make sense of certain kinds of meanings. So I think there's a broader project here, but Brandom's own approach is to spell out meaning in terms of inferential role and then unpack inferential role in terms of normative statuses. But then that raises the question, what are normative statuses? And if we want to be naturalists, we don't want norms as things that are out there free-floating in the world without any explanation. So where are the norms? Brandom's approach is to explain normative statuses in terms of normative attitudes. So what we do is we explain what it is to be right or wrong in what one says, at least in part, determined by or explained by what those around you in the linguistic community take to be right or wrong. Perhaps constrained by facts about the way the world is, but the thought is that and means and is not something that we just discover about the nature of reality. It's instead something that is at least partly determined by the conventions we use that govern the term and. Okay, and then Brandom gives some account of how normative attitudes are collectively instituted via some kind of naturalistic story of positive and negative feedback training regimens. But there's not much that goes on in that account. So he talks about stick beating. I think we should look at stick beating and flock tending. I think these are the two things. There's an old tradition rooted in largely in religious motifs, that mercy and severity are two things that we have to keep in balance. You shouldn't be excessively merciful at the expense of severity, but that you shouldn't be excessively severe at the expense of mercy. And I think you see it in even the representation of the Pharaoh with the flail and the shepherd's crook. Now, the flail is a threshing item for beating wheat from flesh, the grain from stalks, threshing grain. And so you see here the agriculture and pastoral elements of early human history. But you also see that there's an element of this mercy with the shepherd's crook and severity with the flail. So I think we should think of these dispositions to train people in terms of stick beating and flock tending. So it takes both negative and positive reinforcement. Ultimately, what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that there's a practice of using imperatives that involves stick beating and flock tending that doesn't presuppose normative attitudes, and that collective intentions can be used to spell out these imperatives. And so my aim then is to account for the normative attitudes that Brandom gestures at with things like stick beating in terms of collective intentions spelled out through imperatives. But anyway, the idea is that being right or wrong in whatever one says, and so being capable of thinking whatever one can, is a social achievement. It's in virtue of the fact that the peers around us groom our dispositions to speak and think in certain ways, that we can speak and think in whatever ways we can. Then we have this question, how should we think about stick beating and flock tending? Okay, so I've already given the game away, I guess. The thesis, my thesis, the thesis I'm defending here is that normative attitudes that underwrite and make possible various social normative statuses should be understood in terms of collective intentions, interpreted in terms of planning semantics I presented at last year's workshop. Now, it's a consequence of the view I was developing that the planning states that you need to make sense of normative judgments are more complicated than the planning states that you need to make sense of collective intentions. And I'm going to argue that this difference in the way one plans via an intention and the way one plans via a normative claim makes sense of the difference that Sellers refers to in his reference in the last section of Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man when he's given his philosophical anthropology about Jones. From the grunts and groans of the cave to the subtle and polymensional discourse of the drawing room, the laboratory, and the study. And I'm going to further, I think one of the great things that's come out of this conference is how much it does seem that there is convergence, at least on the issues we're interested in. And so one further thing I'm going to argue, and I hope you can tell me whether you think this is right, is that this is a way of making sense of the intentions that Glenda referred to yesterday. So I think this is one, my proposal is this is a way you can spell out the notion of an intention because it's simpler than a judgment about what ought to be. And this is a way of defending Yorda's claim that correctness is grounded in certain kinds of practical attitudes in the tendencies of individual members of the society to make others do certain correct things rather than others. So I really want to take seriously that make others do certain things. Okay, so this is, I'll go over this fairly quickly. I just want to have this on the table. It's not that important, the details, but I want to have it out there, and I'm kind of proud of it, so. So this is stuff that was Gibbard in Thinking How to Live indicates that there's a semantics that you can take possible worlds to characterize the way things are and planning states, maximally determined planning of actions to characterize the way things ought to be. Now, in response to Gibbard's book, a bunch of people said, well, look, you can't make sense of all the different ways that sentences are engaged, you can't make sense of all the different ways we disjoin sentences with disjunction, it doesn't look like it works. Now, it's been somewhat frustrating for me that the people who make this claim either ignore or propose as if it's something new, a distinction between a certain kind of choice, choosing preferentially, or as I call it, single-mindedly, or indifferently. But Gibbard himself explicitly makes that distinction. He doesn't use it in the way that I do here to make clear that there is a semantics that's compositionally adequate. But he makes that distinction. So for instance, Mark Schroeder just doesn't make the distinction at all. Jamie Dreyer does, but he proposes it as if it's his own. He presents it in a couple places as if this is something he's done. But it's there in Gibbard. And what's interesting is that Sellers, in a couple of papers in the 60s and 70s, when he's spelling out this thought that moral judgment should be seen as this we shall intention, Sellers said, well, we need to make a distinction between preference and choosing from preference and choosing from indifference, but he doesn't spell that out in any detail. Now, I've conversed with Gibbard a couple of times, but I haven't asked him whether he got this from Sellers, because Gibbard was at the University of Pittsburgh for a few years at the end of the 70s. So there could have been some direct cross-pollination there, but I'm not sure. At any rate, here's the way I'm formalizing. So take a possible world as just a maximally determinate state of affairs, such that every descriptive sentence is either true or false, and we can define worlds as just sets of sentences. So a deontic hyperplan is a maximally determinate plan for what one would choose to do in any circumstance, including what one would do if one were other people. So what one would choose to do if one were Caesar faced with crossing the Rubicon. That's an example that Gibbard uses. These choices are always either taken under the attitude of single-mindedness or indifference. Now, the way I'm spelling it out, I'm taking the former as basic. So, and I think that a single-minded choice, to the extent this distinction is made, the term that's used is preference, but I don't think that's quite right, because you might think that any choice you make exhibits your preferences. And I think single-minded makes for a better term, because the contrast is really with an indifferent choice. Okay, so here's the thought. One chooses an action A single-mindedly just in case choosing any action B that is incompatible with A would involve violating one's single-minded planning commitments. More precisely, one chooses A single-mindedly just in case one rejects every choice incompatible with A. So the idea of rejection here is essential to the notion of choosing single-mindedly. And I'm going to gloss this with a couple of examples. So you can plan on choosing single-mindedly to dress professionally for work tomorrow. That's a mental state you can be in. In that mental state, you're rejecting every action incompatible with dressing professionally. At the same time, you can plan to wear the gray suit with the blue tie instead of the black suit with the red tie, without thinking that the one you don't choose is something to be rejected. That is to say, you can choose indifferently between those two to wear the one rather than the other. And an indifferent choice then, one chooses an action indifferently just in case there is some action B that's incompatible with A and which could have been undertaken without violating any of your single-minded commitments. In this case, you're rejecting the choices you don't take that you consider permitted. So it's then the single-minded choice that's primitive here. So choosing single-mindedly, rejecting is basic, and in gloss, choosing indifferently is the rejection of the rejection. And notice that rejecting is not just choosing not to do something, because when I planned to wear the gray suit with the blue tie, thinking that the black suit with the red tie would have been okay, I don't reject the other one in the way that I reject wearing my gym clothes. So I think it's clear we can be in mental states such as these, and that in the example I gave, the mental state of planning to single-mindedly choose to perform the determinable dressing professionally, while planning to indifferently choose among the determinations, maybe genus-species relations, that's a mental state constituted by the set of plans where one chooses single-mindedly to dress professionally, together with some plans that involve choosing indifferently to wear one suit and not the other, and some plans that involve choosing indifferently to wear the other suit and not the one. And so maybe you haven't made up your mind the night before which suit you'll wear. But the thought is, whatever choice you make is going to be indifferent between them in the sense that you're not single-mindedly rejecting or choosing not to wear the other in the way that you choose single-mindedly not to wear gym clothes. Now, it's convention to treat this mental state as believing that either suit is permitted, while believing that dressing professionally is obliged, and think of plans of action as somehow involving these beliefs. And so for those in the grip of this convention, it seems like the mental states I'm appealing to should be analyzed through a single notion of choice, together with some deontic beliefs about what is obliged and permitted. My contention is that we're dealing with the phenomenon of practical rationality here, and it shouldn't be so quickly assimilated to the categories of theoretical rationality. Contrary to the received wisdom about the successes and shortcomings of Sellers' Gibbard semantics, the hyperplan apparatus does deliver compositionally adequate semantics able to give a clear picture of the joint contribution of theoretical and practical rationality to make the cognition, spelled out in terms of possible worlds and plans of action. In order to deliver the right kind of entailment relations between what one judges one ought to do and what one judges is permitted, you have to distinguish mental planning concerning what ought to be from planning states concerning what shall be. Because you want it to come out that I ought to dress professionally tomorrow, but I can't, or that I ought to dress professionally tomorrow and I won't, or that I shall not. So we want to at least make sense of those kinds of mental states. So that requires distinguishing plans concerning what you intend to do and plans concerning what you think you ought to do. So an intentional hyperplan is a maximally determinate plan for what one would choose to do in any circumstance, including what one would do for one or other people. In this case, however, the distinction between indifferent and single-minded choices is irrelevant. It turns out it just doesn't matter whether you make that distinction. So to forecast, I think that the reason, here's the way I'm thinking about this, that the reason deontic mental states involve this additional complexity is because they require us to distinguish a determinable from its determinations, or a genus from its species. We have to think about the difference between choosing to dress professionally and the instances that would satisfy that, but which are separate, which are different among them. Whereas choosing intentionally to do something, well, the animal, it says in the self-consciousness section of the phenomenology of spirit, follows to and consumes the food without further reflection. So animals don't make this distinction, they just do or don't do. So that's the thought I'm working with. I'm going to try to spell that out. Okay, so a deontic intentional hyperstate then is a triple of a world, a deontic hyperplane, and an intentional hyperplane. We let S range over those elements. Now, in order to make sense of certain kinds of entailments, there's an additional permutation that is not important. Basically, this just is a constraint on planning states that ensures that any planning state that involves what you shall do is one that commits you to doing it. It's a mental state where the world of that triple has you doing the action that the intention of that triple has you do. So this is just a constraint that's needed to make sure that you get the right kinds of entailments between commitment that you shall do something and commitment that you will do something. So on this account, that to say I shall do phi entails that I will do phi. Commits you to doing it. It doesn't require that the truth of the one entails the truth of the other, but rather that the mental state of intending to phi is one that commits you to the claim that you will. So if you don't like that entailment, you can just drop this constraint. Yes?
Could you just repeat what's the difference between intentional hyperplane and deontic hyperplane?
The only difference is whether or not the plans individuate choices in terms of choosing single-mindedly or indifferently.
Okay.
The intentional ones don't. It's just whether or not you choose. The deontic ones require distinguishing whether you choose single-mindedly or indifferently. Okay. Okay, so then we can give a semantics for what one ought to do. Yes?
And the intentional hyperplane is a subset of the...
Come again?
Is the intentionally hyperplane a subset of the...
No. Originally I was thinking that's the way to think about it, but I actually think now you should keep them separate, in part because you want to distinguish what is chosen without reference to single-minded or indifferent choices, and what's chosen considering single-minded and indifferent choices. So think of these two separate sets of plans. Okay, so the claim that people ought to A and C expresses commitment to the claim that people ought to A and C expresses commitment to the plan of single-mindedly choosing A and C, or one anyone. The claim that it's forbidden to A and C is the set of plans where you're any agent choose single-mindedly not to A and C. And then the claim that it's permitted to A and C is the complement of the claim that it's forbidden. So it's the set of choices where you choose either to do it single-mindedly or to better not to do it indifferently. We can then give semantics for individual intentions, taking iota to range over the first person and the first person singular and plural pronoun. I shall A and C, where I is either I or we, shall A and C expresses commitment to the set of deontic intentional hyperstates where everyone who is one of the group determined by the index rule chooses A and C in the corresponding intentional hyperplanes. So this is all on the handout too. So, because intentional sentences are evaluated according to non-acratic, deontic intentional hyperstates, commitment to the sentence, I shall A and C commits one to the sentence, I will A and C. But again, that's not to say that the claim that you shall ensures that you will. It's just that you are committed to the latter if you're committed to the former. Because non-acratic deontic intentional hyperstates do not put any constraints on deontic hyperclaims, it's not the case that commitment to the claim that I should A and C commits you to the claim that you will A and C. And for the same reason, it's not the case that commitment to the claim that I should A and C commits you to the claim that you shall A and C. So it falls out of this proposal that the planning states that constitute the state of mind one is in with an expression of intention are simpler than the state of mind one is in with an expression of deontic judgment. Simpler in the sense that the choices that constitute those plans don't distinguish between single-minded and different choices. And again, my thought is that that marks a capacity in practical rationality to distinguish determinables and determinations or species and genus and species. That's the thought. But now what I want to do is I want to apply this to the analytic pragmatism that Brandom develops in between saying and doing. So I think there is a line of thinking in between saying and doing that we can use as a guide here. So there's a bunch of these meaning use diagrams that Brandom gives, but there's a couple that I want to focus on because they raise some interesting issues. So what Brandom is doing in between saying and doing is he's looking at relationships between practices and vocabularies, where practices are either sufficient or necessary for the use of certain vocabularies, and then when vocabularies are either sufficient or necessary for the specification of certain practices. And in particular, he's looking at these pragmatically mediated vocabulary relations, where one vocabulary is sufficient to specify a set of practices that is itself sufficient to use a different set of vocabulary. And so the first one I want to focus on is this meaning use diagram from page 101 of Between Saying and Doing. And it's a way that Brandom thinks he's spelling out Sellers' claim and influence of meaning that the language of modality is a transposed language of norm. So language of modality talk about what's necessary and what's possible. Language of normativity talk about what things ought to be or how things may be. Okay, so a vocabulary of norms is sufficient for specifying a practice of modal reasoning, in the sense that any judgment about what is necessary and what is possible can be specified in terms of what one is obliged and permitted to assent to, or to be disposed to assent to, at least. So here we have a vocabulary practice, or VP sufficiency relation. So down at the bottom there. At the same time, the practice of modal reasoning is in turn sufficient for deploying a vocabulary of modality. If those are inferential transitions you use, then you can use modal language to specify them. As a result, then, there's this pragmatically mediated semantic relation between the vocabulary of normativity and vocabulary of vocabulary of normativity and vocabulary of modality. Okay, I'm going to bracket something that I think is actually really important. There's a debate that we have not begun to address, let alone settle, concerning whether we should think about modal claims as descriptions of the way the world is, or expressions about how we try to get other people to think. And we do this all the time. There's all kinds of language that we use in certain contexts that on its surface grammar appears descriptive, but is actually playing some other role. So if I'm your boss, and I say the cups go in the cupboard, I'm not describing a regularity about the kitchen, I'm telling you something to do. So language is like this in a lot of different ways, and I don't think it's clear at all that modal terms or normative terms, these things that have been specified via possible worlds, as if they're just one more bit of the descriptive arsenal in human language. It's not clear at all that this language should be assimilated to description. It may have a more action-guiding role, like if I'm your boss and I tell you the cups go in the cupboard. But I'm bracketing that. I think big issues here. Sellers in the logical syntax of language before he's convinced by Tarski and Carnap, Carnap in the logical syntax of language before he's convinced by conversations among Tarski and Hradec to give up syntax for semantics and to trade meta-linguistic functional classification for state descriptions and early analog of possible worlds. Carnap develops a bunch of this. And early inference and meaning directly looks at Carnap's project and syntax. But that's 20 years after Carnap has moved on. And so there's been this emphasis on semantics, model theory. I mean, in many idiolects, semantics and model theory are just coextension. But I think there's a genuine alternative here that focuses on proof theory, rules of inference, something like pragmatism. But that's mostly in the background. Okay, so here's the basic meaning use diagram. Now Bob does some other things in between saying and doing, and he connects this meaning use diagram to another one. So what he thinks is, and he's spelling out an idea of Sellers here, so I'll flag some of this stuff that sits in Sellers, but I'm really just expositing the view. So the idea is that the grasp of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, OED vocabulary, which is kind of clever. OED vocabulary, ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, requires being able to specify at least something about what that vocabulary entails and rules out the various contexts of use. If I make no discriminations concerning what the sentence, the cup of water is on the table, would commit me to at various contexts, then I do not understand what I have said when I utter that sentence. Now, I used this as an example before. I heard, I believe it was in Lotso's talk about the kids that come into rooms, experimental rooms, and when there's water in the cup, they get worried about whether they're going to spill it. But that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. To be onto something as the thing it is in the world, you have to be able to reason counterfactually about what it would or wouldn't do in various contexts. So it's that capacity to place the thing in space of implication that's a condition on uttering any descriptive sentence at all. And so the practice of counterfactual reasoning, then, is PV necessary. It's a practice that's necessary for using the vocabulary of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. So Sellers says something like this in Counterfactual Dispositions and Causal Modalities. It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects, even such basic expressions as words for the perceptible characteristics of molar objects, locate these objects in space of implications that they describe rather than merely label. The descriptive and explanatory resources of the language go hand in hand. So that the glass is filled with water tells me that the spilling of the liquid onto the floor is a pregnant possibility in this context. And so I'll be cognitively and affectively responsive to the range of conditions that would realize that possibility. So this is good. So the claim then is that the practice of using counterfactually robust inferences is PV necessary for the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. This is an autonomous discursive practice. We're going to ignore this here and this arrow. So for that, we won't need to worry about it. But basically, Brandom's claim is that the practice of using counterfactually robust inferences is necessary for any practice sufficient to deploy an autonomous discursive practice. So any autonomous language that is sufficient for describing the world is such that necessarily you have to make these counterfactually robust inferences. But we're going to forget that relation for now. Okay, the practice of discriminating counterfactual ranges of robust inferences is itself practice sufficient for the practices that are sufficient for using modal vocabulary. Because, and this is on the handout at page, pages in your handout. Page 4. So under 16C, the practice of discriminating ranges of counterfactual robustness is practice sufficient for practices that are PV sufficient for the use of modal vocabulary. That is, practice of using counterfactual robustness can be algorithmically elaborated into a practice of using modal inferences, and I think in virtue of these equivalencies. Now, this is something that I thought I came up with when I was working on my dissertation. It turns out Timothy Williamson had given these definitions earlier. But I think this is clearly a case where we can see the use of counterfactual inferences can be used to specify the use of modal operators in virtue of thinking of judgments about what must be its quantification of the antecedents of subjective conditions. And we say things like that. No matter what, if the cup were spilled, the water would hit the floor. So no matter what, I'm quantifying over the antecedent of what will be a subjunctive. If the cup were spilled, if the cup were tipped over, the water would spill on the floor. The use of modal vocabulary itself is VP sufficient for using, for specifying a practice of counterfactual reasoning, where one can be taught to say necessarily, from necessarily P, to make those counterfactual inferences. Once you know that necessarily P has that function, you'll be taught to make those kind of actually robust. And because modal vocabulary is sufficient to specify practices that are necessary for any OED vocabulary, there's a resulting pragmatically mediated vocabulary sufficiency relation via this practice. So the practice of using modal vocabulary can be used to specify a practice sufficient for using, or rather necessary for using, ordinary empirical vocabulary. And so we have this resulting relation. Now, meaning-use relations, these diagrams should be seen as a heuristic. There's no proof that's going on here. This is just a heuristic. All the work is being done in the argumentation. But I think it's a useful heuristic. So this is page 5, I think. Yes, page 5 of your diagram. You can see both of these are on that page there. So you can see that the arrows that are at issue in the first diagram are here in the same order in the second. So it's just a heuristic. This is not a proof, but I think it's a useful heuristic because when you reorganize the diagram in this shape, now you have a sense of nascent teleology. It looks like you've got some kind of direction. And so now we can think about, look, if we have this kind of pragmatically mediated semantic relation moving from a language of vocabulary of normativity to vocabulary of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary mediated by these practices, what kinds of simpler practices might underwrite these practices? Now, Brandom suggests at one point that there's a normative practice that underlies the use of normative vocabulary. So on page 111 of Between Saying and Doing, he has a meaning-use diagram which has a practice of normativity beneath this here. So he suggests we should think of that. And presumably this practice is one of deploying the deontic attitudes that are made such heavy use of in making it explicit. But how should we think about these deontic attitudes? What kind of vocabulary practice would be sufficient for engaging in the practice of adopting normative attitudes? So at this point, I'm going to work my way through to this diagram. This is what I'm going to be arguing for here. And it's going to lead to this resulting diagram. So that's where we're going. This is on the handout. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through that in stages. So as organisms, human beings are purposefully directed toward our environment in various ways, and success in human life requires shared pursuit of common purposes, including things like hunting, finding shelter. So think about the cave painting that we used as the background for this talk. By the way, I did not cite the author of that, but that's because we don't know. It's on a series of paintings in Spain that we think were sometime between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago. So it's not clear who made that painting, but those are the kinds of things that early humans... Some ancestors of Jesus, that's right. That's right, some ancestors of Jesus. Good. So imagine a hypothetical ancestral community whose members begin to communicate with one another through patterns of verbal behavior. Not necessarily vocabularies, but some kind of vocal utterances. Maybe not even verbal, but at least vocal utterances. So it turns out that it's one of these things that with a range of Indo-European languages, things like don't spit in the fire, communicate roughly the same thing across these languages. So you can imagine that these people were using vocal utterances to communicate to other people, but also to shape their dispositions. Now suppose members of a lineage within this community were more adept at recognizing and anticipating the purposive activities of their fellows. So with a nod towards Seller's philosophical anthropology, let's call this the lineage of Joneses. Let's suppose there was a family of Joneses out there that was better at doing this than other people. The capacity to cognitively track counterfactual relations among states of affairs in the world, with regard to the pursuit of purposes, would have been beneficial on the Joneses' life. So look, I'm on to a glass of water only insofar as I can reason about it as the kind of thing that it is. Similarly, I'm on to you as whatever it is you're up to, only insofar as I can reason counterfactually about what you would or wouldn't do in different ways. So I can think of you as stalking the lion, only insofar as I can make anticipation. Well, you probably wouldn't be stalking the lion. I think of you as stalking the antelope as opposed to fleeing the lion, only insofar as I can anticipate what you would or wouldn't do in various situations. So if the grass that you're approaching rustles and you run away, I can think, well, you're probably not stalking an antelope. Okay, just as the individual in the community capable of engaging in such acts of cognition as anticipating one's peers' purpose and dispositions, just as the individual in the community capable of engaging in such acts of cognition would gain a social and so reproductive advantage over his or her peers, so would a lineage of these Joneses spread throughout a community, because they would be more successful at things like hunting and reproducing. And so you'd have an evolutionary game of keeping up with the Joneses. Is that some English speakers at least?
Yeah,
That's an expression? Okay. So you have an evolutionary game of keeping up with the Joneses. You've got this competition for the ability to better purposefully anticipate the activities of your peers. So these things would spread both because they're efficacious, would be transmitted via education. Look, the person who can get the group to hunt better is going to be given more rights when it comes to the things that we have to distribute in the community. And these practices of education then are going to be spread. And also because of reproductive successes and genetic cases that are underlying. Now, while the Joneses are imagined to have an advantageous cognitive capacity to track purposive and causal relations, the Joneses themselves may not be aware of what they're doing. But insofar as the ability to shape one's peers' dispositions in the service of one's purposes is evolutionarily advantageous, the ability to recognize that this is what people are doing will be advantageous as well. And so self-consciousness of one's own and other purposes in speech and deed won't be far behind after the emergence of the Joneses. So this is to say that the purposive practices of human beings are PV sufficient for the use of imperatival vocabulary. Practices of being purposefully engaged toward the world and one's peers are sufficient for using vocal, if not verbal, imperatives, shaping the dispositions of those around you to do the things you want them to do.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Does this mean that, for example, these people should have a different imperative word for every different action?
No.
Because if they don't have still an empirical vocabulary that allows to distinguish fire from ice, for example, how do you make a distinction between the imperative that is addressed or is used when you try to prevent that someone goes into the fire and the one that...
So I think that the notion of an imperative is a fairly late-coming issue. I think we should think of these things as shaping dispositions in terms of positive and negative reinforcement. Stick beating and flock tending.
Yeah, but my question is, at this stage, we don't need to distinguish an imperative from other imperatives. There is only one imperative, one kind of gesture or something that...
Yeah, I don't think that a particular speech act that counts as the imperative is what's... I mean, I don't think we need a particular speech act to have
Well,
a particular lexical thing marked as imperative. Because think about something like the cups go in the cupboard. That can count as a command given the social relations we're in, even though it doesn't carry any grammatical mark that it's an imperative. And so I think similarly, things like, Wittgenstein's got this language at the beginning of the investigations, block, slab. I don't think we need to suppose there's a lexical thing that marks the imperative, so much as there are practices that involve issuing things that I think we can look back and say are imperatives.
Yeah, but my concern is rather not what makes the imperative an imperative, but what imperative it is. What are you commanding when you are using that gesture or whatever?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying. So is this a question about how do we know that the person was telling me to bring him the slab as opposed to put the slab over there?
I imagine that it simply says no, but no what?
Yeah, okay. So here I'm imagining that we share certain life form. This came up, Wittgenstein used it, but I think actually Michael Thompson's discussion of life form was much better. There's a range of things that we are affectively responsive to in the environment in virtue of the kind of organisms we are. So when we're both crouching like this, and Wittgenstein at one point says the pointing, why does the pointing go this way rather than this way? Well look, if we're both crouching like this and we're out here and we've got our spears and I go like that, or like this, I mean, sure, in the abstract we can ask whether, how do we know that I'm saying do this or that? Sure, that's something we have to be worried about, but I think in terms of understanding what God is able to do, the kind of things we did, the fact that we share an environment and an evolutionary ancestry that grounds us in a certain more or less common view of the world means that those problems in practice aren't that big a deal. Yeah.
So I was looking for what you were saying about the in the handle. I think there was one bit that is not in the handle, but I don't know. But why it's not why imperatives are not possible before there might be a more simple way of
Imperatives not possible before what?
before the contrafactual purposive understanding. So are you saying that the imperatives, because the purposive practices are really sufficient, then they are sort of built upon or like more complex, or at the very least it's as complex as the contrafactual purposive?
No, the contrafactual thinking seems to be more complex cognitively than
That's
another form of
imperative.
Right, yeah. So the ability to engage in counterfactual thinking, I think, is rooted in dispositions to act and maybe say something in certain contexts. And so I don't deny that is, I mean, maybe it's more complex than the use of imperatives. These are just sufficiency relations between practices and vocabularies. So the claim with this diagram is that up here, this practice of making counterfactual inferences is necessary. This is the only necessity relations.
Okay.
All of these are sufficiency relations.
Okay,
So the claim is not that this is necessary for this, but rather that this is sufficient for all of this.
just strategically. Would you like to be interrupted, or would you like to finish?
Well, it depends. I mean,
I wasn't clear. I'm sorry that I interrupted. I wasn't clear about the claim. Now I'm taking it.
okay, as long as we're good. I think that's good. If there's something that you are absolutely getting hung up on, please interrupt me. I was going to try to go at an hour at the most. I worry I'm going to go a little bit over. Whatever. Just keep interrupting me. Let's just see how it goes. If you start to get tired, I'll try to speed it up. I do think it's important to follow along, to understand as you go along. So I do appreciate that.
It's fine.
Okay, so we're back here. Okay, yeah, so the upshot though, these are all, with the exception of this as a necessity claim, all of these are sufficiency claims. So the claim is not that this, you have this before you have this, but rather once you've got this, you can start doing all the rest of it. And that this is necessary for this. And again, for a vocabulary empirical language, not for any whatever kind of pre-vocal, cognitive, non-conceptual engagement one has with the world. Okay. Okay. So this is to say that the purpose of practices of human beings are PV sufficient for the use of imperatival vocabulary, through which purposes are shared among members of the community in terms of the enforcement of commands. Now we can think of these as vocal commands or imperatives in language, but you can also think of them as just stick, meaning, and flock time. If I hit you, that's a way of giving you an imperative. That's a way of saying don't do that. Now we need not suppose that what will become explicit imperatives are conceived as such at the start. So just as a representational state, say if B can be of a field of flowers without it being as a field of flowers, so can obedience to an imperative have the practical consequence of sharing purposes, even if the creatures responding to the command are not aware of the purpose for which the command is given. When I go shh, because we're trying to stalk and prey, and you hush, your activity is further the purpose, even though you have no idea why you're doing it. So the use of imperatives enforces the social pursuit of purposes. And once there are socially pursued purposes, there are social practices that are right and wrong, given the purposes those practices aim at. And so the practice of using imperatives suffices to set up institutions within the community that delineate obliged, entitled, and forbidden behavior. But that's to say that imperatival vocabulary is VP sufficient for normative vocabulary. Now, I think that the use of what I call teleological imperatives give expression to this kind of pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabulary imperatives and vocabulary normatives. Because if I tell you shut the window, that's telling you something to do. But if I tell you shut the window so that the baby doesn't get cold, so we use this to-place so that teleological operator, linking a means to an end. And it's peculiar about this purposive operator that you can embed imperatives in the first position. Not all locutions are like that. So if I tell you shut the window so that the baby doesn't get cold, that gives you, by giving you the reason at which that command is directed, the end, the means is aimed at, you can then think about other things you might have to do to see that that end is realized. So if I don't know if the door is also open, but you do, then when I tell you shut the window so that the baby doesn't get cold, you can reason your way to shutting the door as well. So the practice of using normative vocabulary is PP sufficient for a purposive practice, insofar as the use of normative vocabulary is directed at codifying whatever norms actually obtain in the community in question. Thus, one who is doing something subject to normative assessment is already doing enough to count as acting purposefully, insofar as what she does aims at being correct according to the norm. And so together we have the following meaning use diagram. Well, this one, but we're just jumping ahead here. Okay, so finally, notice that any practice sufficient for introducing modal vocabulary is PP sufficient for engaging in practices sufficient for introducing normative vocabulary. For the use of modal vocabulary, like nearly everything we do, is something we're capable of doing correctly and incorrectly. And so that means the two meaning use diagrams, Hobbes reordered this way, and then mine here, compose for this. If this line of argument is sound, then we now have an answer as to how the practice of adopting normative attitudes comes to be instituted, via the purposive practices that give rise to the imperatives that shape the behaviors of the members of the linguistic community. I call this Jones's ladder. So Jacob's ladder, Jacob goes to sleep somewhere in Israel at some point, has this dream of a ladder on which angels are ascending and descending from heaven to earth. So if Jacob's ladder is one on which the angels descend from heaven to earth, Jones's ladder is one on which human beings have ascended from nature to spirit. A little chuckle. That's all I'm looking for, just a little chuckle. Okay, so this leaves us with a question then. What are these purposive practices? My proposal is the collective intention. So this is what I'm going to finish with, another 5 or 10 minutes or something. Which will put me right around an hour, so that's not bad. So I've argued that imperatival vocabulary is VB sufficient for the use of normative vocabulary, insofar as it's pragmatically mediated by these normative practices. That's to say that a vocabulary of norms is pragmatically mediated by a vocabulary of imperatives. I've also argued that purposive practices are PV sufficient for the use of imperatives. These purposive practices may take the form of stick beating and flock tending. So this is under number 27 now. And notice here, you can characterize expressions to do what's obliged, permitted, and forbidden in certain contexts, just in terms of positive and negative reinforcement. So there's no need to give an additional complexity to the attitude that underwrites the imperatives to make sense of 3 deontic states. Because being disposed to stick beat doing an A is one way of giving expression to the thought that A is forbidden in C. Being disposed to stick beat doing A and C is one way of giving expression to the thought that doing A is forbidden in C. Being disposed to stick beat not doing A and C is one way of giving expression to the thought that A is obliged in C. And then being disposed neither to stick beat doing A nor not doing A in C is one way of giving expression to the thought that A is permitted in C. Not that this happens at every case, but that in a community where you have practices of stick beating and flock tending, the fact that some things get stick beaten, others, if you do them, some things get stick beaten if you don't do them, and some things are in the middle, makes it possible to begin to think about the kinds of choices that you'll ultimately make under a single-minded or indifferent attitude, even though the stick beating is just choosing to do one thing or another. So the use of the imperatival form is a way of voicing one's dispositions to sanction behavior without actually sanctioning anything physically. Nevertheless, for the imperative to be an imperative, there must be some institution or threat of sanctioning force. So if I say the cups go in the cupboard and you're not my employee, or you're not a roommate, or you otherwise don't care, that may mean nothing to you. So there has to be these institutional or physical sanctioning practices in place. So this suggests that the purposive practices that underlie the use of imperatives can be understood as collective intentions to positively and negatively sanction various activities among one's peers. In the evolutionary genealogy of the species, this might have taken the form of plans concerning what one would say or do one were one other members of the community. The things that we did was, I wouldn't say that if I was you, or I wouldn't do that if I was you. But won't the Brandomian Brandonian be worried that intentions presuppose the semantic content that normative attitudes are supposed to underwrite? Look, if intentions are propositionally contentful, then you can't use intentions to make sense of the normative attitudes that make sense of propositional contents, right? No, I don't think the Brandomian should be worried about that. First of all, dispositions to stick, beat, and flock tend, understood as dispositions concerning whether or not to do anything, suffice to introduce a practice of normative vocabulary. That's the claim about those relations between stick beating and expression of something is obliged and forbidden. Now, in making it explicit, Brandom seems to ground normative practices in dispositions to sanction. And he does this at one point when he's talking about a practice of permitting people to go to the theater, whether or not they're allowed to go to the theater. Oh, I meant to have this as an in-between slide. Sorry. So this is from making it explicit. Practices of this sort, that is just sanctioning whether or not you go into the theater, can be described in purely responsive terms for pre-linguistic communities. The entitlement given and recognized in these practices has a content for an attributor, insofar as that attributor practically partitions the space of possible performances into those that have been authorized and those that have not, by being disposed to respond differently in two cases. These sanctioning responses, for instance, admitting versus rejecting, and the performances they discriminate, entering the theater, can be characterized apart from an antecedent to specification of the practice of conferring and recognizing entitlement defined by the means. The sanctions applied in taking or treating someone as entitled can be specified in non-normative terms. So I think that's right. I think that the dispositions to flock tend and stick beating when doing that, and the collective intentions can be understood to underline these things. So similarly, the planning states required for collective intentions don't discriminate between the single-minded and indifferent choices that constitute normative attitudes. They require only planning on whether or not to do something. Just as the behavioral dispositions that underlie these plans require nothing more than the ability to discriminate occasions for the actualization of the disposition. And so planning on choosing whether or not to say something or what a particular member of a community is a capacity that does not by itself presuppose a distinction between choosing indifferently and choosing single-mindedly. Well, at least it doesn't involve the actualization of that capacity. Maybe if you speak at all, you have to be able to engage in those kinds of single-minded and different choices. But the use of that vocabulary to plan on choosing whether or not to say something, that by itself doesn't require that you plan on choosing to say it single-mindedly or indifferently. And so there's a clear sense in which collective intentions can be understood as the basis for the normative attitudes that underlie the Brandomian theory of meaning without presupposing the kinds of conceptually contentful mental states that these normative attitudes make possible on that theory. So this is number 31 now, and I'm just about done. So the picture is the following. Linguistic meaning and the propositionally contentful mental states made possible with the grasp of a natural language are at least partially explained by inferential role. Inferential role is at least partly explained by normative statuses. Normative statuses are at least partly explained by normative attitudes. Normative attitudes are at least partially explained by purposive practices, and purposive practices are at least partially explained by collective intentions. I said above that Jones's ladder is one on which humans ascended from nature and spirit, and we're now in a position to deepen our appreciation of that idea. For the distinction between the kinds of plans needed to account for collective intentions and the kinds of plans needed to account for normative attitudes makes sense of the difference between the non-conceptual grunts and groans of the cave to the subtle and polydimensional discourse of the drawing room, the laboratory of the study, as Sellers says at the end of Philosophy and Science, or Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind. So the subtle and polydimensional discourse is one that is fraught with ought, as Sellers says at another point, which is to say that it requires you to distinguish what we ought to do, what we may, from what we may and may not, or what we ought to say from what we may and may not. On the semantics I gave at the beginning, this means that such discourse requires us to be able to distinguish determination, determinable, or genus-species relations in practical rationality. So the ability to mark things as fraught with thought, to engage in that subtle and polydimensional discourse, presupposes a practical capacity to distinguish these genus-species relations, which suggests that it's this practical capacity that underwrites and makes possible our ability to exercise theoretical rationality in the propositional contentful ways we do. And I think of this as a sort of pragmatism. I think there's a clear sense of pragmatism at work here. But it's one that has, it's way more interconnected with things like proof theory and views in 20th century philosophical logic than a lot of what gets characterized as pragmatism involves. But that's talk for another time, so I'll end there. Thank you. stuff down so I can
No,
translate it.
my question is so simple that you don't need anything to write.
This guy.
I mean,
No, I don't
yes,
believe
and I'm not sure how much I understand. Let me ask this question. It would help me to understand, to assess the moves you're making.
Yeah.
For me, it would be very helpful to understand just what you mean by collective intentionality. But it is sort of, I need to know what conception you have in mind.
Yeah.
Because it's a very compressive concept.
So I want.
What is it you mean? Is it a mental state? Is it a mental content, mode, or subject?
Yeah. So
What have you got in mind?
I have tried to avoid in this talk. I've tried to avoid commitments on that front as much as I can, and just look at the semantics. So my conception of collective intentionality is meant to be as narrow enough as to account for the semantics I gave at the beginning. So I think of, as a pragmatist, I think of sentences as the primary bearers of linguistic meaning. And so I think of a sentence like I or we shall A and C is expressing commitment to one of these planning states.
Okay, so it's just basically collective. Collective intentionality is what's described in sentences that refer to joint goals. Is that it?
Collective intentionality is the phenomenon that's associated with the mental states or the contents that the semantics gives for sentences ascribing joint goals. And,
Okay.
and in the details, it's planning about what I would do were I any member of the relevant community.
Okay, but then I have the Brandomian worry, because surely there's got to be a distinction between the case in which I have a goal in mind that sort of involves you and the action that's intended in the sentence describing that intention is me just taking you there, just making it the case that you go there, taking you like this and dragging you to the restaurant.
So can you give an example of what's the
Okay,
sentence?
let's say I say we, meaning you and I, intend to go to Starbucks after the lecture.
So shall is my preferred.
Yeah, shall.
You shall.
Give me some leeway here because I cannot spell this out in Sellersian terms.
Sure.
But I think any vocabulary that refers to goals is okay here, right? You could say.
Okay. So, yeah.
Okay, so that's the sentence. We shall, if you wish, go to Starbucks later. What it is that's intended is me sort of forcing you, using the stick, making you to go there. And that's certainly different from a genuine collective intention where there is an understanding that it is as a cause of the intention that we shall go there, right? So you can spell this out in different terms, but it sort of implies an understanding of the two of us being normatively bound to each other. And then the Brandomian worry kicks in because you already have this sort of relation in place, You want to strip it of all of that.
Sorry, I don't know.
And make it simple so that you can come with the normative stuff. Just a second, later on, but it seems...
You said strip of all that stuff. I don't know what you think I'm stripping it of.
You're stripping it of the normative relations, I thought. So if we intend to do something together,
Yes.
you're sort of normatively, you're committed to do it to me in the same way as, say, my future, if I intend to prepare a coffee, and that's an activity that has several stages, my future self is committed to me.
Yeah.
To do it in a way that sort of serves the purpose, right? So there is normative relations, right? So
Yes,
if I intend to
That's
prepare
right.
coffee, I intend to do it in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
And that way, that's sort of my concept, or however you call it, of doing it, right?
Yeah.
That determines what it is I'm intending. Now, if we intend to do it in a certain way, and that's the social normative structure, right? I thought that you wanted to derive the norms from the imperatives. So the imperative is the first thing, and imperative can be whatever instrument I have to make it the case that you act in that way.
Yes.
But then you cannot start from genuine collective intention because that's
no,
already normative.
No. So look, the fact that there may be all kinds of normative relations involved in our purposive practices is compatible with the claim that a practice of using explicitly normative vocabulary can be specified via a vocabulary of using imperatives. So the claim is not that you don't have norms on the scene until you've got imperatives, but that rather, once you have purposive practices, as fraught with thought as anything that organisms have, or anything that social organisms have, that once you've got that, that's enough to introduce a vocabulary that is itself sufficient enough to specify a set of practices for using normative vocabulary. So it's not that you don't have normative, it's not that normativity doesn't enter the scene until here, but that rather a practice sufficient for using normative vocabulary doesn't enter the scene until you're here. Does that make sense? Again, these are sufficiency relations. These are the only necessity relations there.
Okay, so let's give a voice to Brandom. Brandom.
Yes, it's a different question. Well, I think this is really good. Really good. So let me see. I think what you're describing is what chimps do, not what hominids do. And then this raises a worry, which Maria not commented. Because, I think, we can make sense of this idea of there being counterfactual relations holding in states of affairs that the chiefs are tracking.
Yep.
And they definitely have this practice of command, if by that one understand this imperative. I think that they have this punishing behavior. But if you fail if a team is not doing what it's supposed to be doing in this very moment, then it's going to be a fight, or it's going to be an expelling, or it's going to be, lose part of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then I'm starting to worry about a little bit about what's sufficient and what is necessary for things.
Okay.
And also, what I think. So, just to add one thought there, I think to what extent, anyway, I don't want to say what I think is required.
Not really worried.
Yeah, just that it seems to me that in order to get something which would be it's a longer discussion, but that gets you close to whatever the human case, where you have language. I mean, if you agree that language requires some sort of shared understanding of this in a sort of more fundamental way, then there's something missing. But put it otherwise. If it is the case that chimps do this, what else happened? That will take you at the end of it.
So I'm not sure the thing you said right before, but where it seemed like you were going with the chimps and what you said at the end, I think I'm with you on. So I'm open to the thought that chimps do all kinds of stuff down here. And I think it's actually an interesting question. I don't know enough about it.
But I think this can be shown empirically.
Yeah, so this is what I would like to know, whether or not they discriminate. Practice is sufficient for using normative vocabulary? I don't know, something...
In your description they do.
Well, okay, so I'm totally open to that then. That actually, I think, is great.
Okay.
To me, that's awesome. Can we then get them to
intellectual and empirical evidence that there is a third-party enforcement of social norms in chimpanzees. There are some kind of attitude, but
there is also, I think, this is something I also when I refer, there is a hierarchical structure. There is an organization of the group. There is the alpha male who sanctions. There is all the timid CFARD evidence on how they react to the vocal calls of the
usually some kind of dyadic interaction. As far as I know, the primatologists say that there is very little third-party enforcement of some group rules
I'm
or
not
norms.
saying that the structure of the punishment has to be the same as ours. I think that what he's describing, that they will stick, well, it wouldn't be stick beating, it would be like, fight, and shouting of the alpha male. But you can have something which is given. So even the Tomasello example is right when the chimps are going for the banana, as long as the banana is in the side of the alpha male, it's a normative behavior that one can describe as, I'd be punished if I were to do this.
Yeah.
Right? So I think
Can I try to respond to that? I think I see the concern, so let me see if I can addressing it with this response. So it would be a bad thing if whatever I thought was going on here in chimps, and that was enough to get them up to here. Because it doesn't look like chimps have an inherent vocabulary, right?
exactly.
Okay, good. So I do think it's important, and I haven't thought about how to do this right, but I do think it's important to flag that there may be other conditions that are necessary for using some of these vocabularies. So it may be the case that something like proto-imperatives are in play in chimps, and that as a result they're doing something like normative practices.
Okay.
But yeah, then the question is, what is it to count as using normative vocabulary, as opposed to say imperatives? What is it to count to use modal vocabulary? So this is, I think, helpful for me, because I'm going to have to think more about how I can make sure that the sufficiency relations are in the context of the kind of organism that has the conceptual or cognitive capacities, the wet way, to be able to do that stuff anyway. And it may be that chimps just don't have it.
Right, that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Good. I have a follow-up question. I have a different question about what collective intentionality according to you is, because, if you, at the basic level, you identify that some kind of widely distributed disposition to sanction either positively or negatively members of a group, I don't think that it's a kind of collective intentionality that anybody would recognize.
No, that's right.
So, but you said that you would like to explain what underlies normative attitudes, like Brandomian, via kind of collective intentions.
That's right.
I myself didn't recognize anything specifically collectively intentional in this kind of disposition. I'm fine with this disposition, though I'm not sure if, for instance, Bernard would like to describe those kind of disposition as kind of sharing purposes, because it's kind of mind shaping, but I can manipulate all the members of the group just in order to do what I want, but I'm not sure if that's what they would like to call sharing of purposes.
Absolutely. So I worry that I went over this too fast. Number 29. It's 27 and 28. So 27 is where I'm looking at the practices of stick beating and flock tending as a way of giving expression to thoughts about what's permitted and forbidden. And this is the kind of thing that I think perhaps chimps can do, right? Maybe they do engage in something that looks like, but then 28 is really important. So the use of the imperatival form is a way of voicing one's dispositions to sanction a behavior without actually sanctioning anything. Now again, maybe social institutions have to be in place for that to happen. But here's my thought. Once you're refraining from engaging in the positive and negative reinforcement of physical bodily harm and support, now you're doing something that involves language. And now you're doing something where you're relating to the individual as if the mere words are going to get them to respond. And that's something that I think is an actualization of capacity that is a collective intention. You can see yourself as putting yourself in the position of other people, what you would say. And that's what the imperative does. So go ahead.
And the vocal calls of the chin is sit for experiments performed that role without
Again, maybe, so as I say, there has to be some story here about what other physical traits an organism has to have to be able to think. Yeah, physical. In the
I
brain.
think that collective
In the brain.
intentionality in the human sense requires more.
Pardon me?
I think that the point is that collective intentionality in the human case is maybe of a different shape, because you have,
Yes,
it's not just a physical thing. So it's something which is part of the conceptual elucidation of what.
Sorry, I just want to follow up on this. I mean physical just in the sense that it may be the case that chimps don't have the ability to put themselves in the minds of other people in the community. That's my claim, is that what's peculiar about collective intentions that's expressed with these imperatives is
is that?
A finger here.
Okay.
You know, it is
What is last one?
So, you know, there's this big thing about sort of consensual action versus strategic interaction. So putting yourself in the mind of another creature can be very useful for a predator. You know, if a predator can put itself in the mind of a prey, it's going to be more successful in catching the prey.
Yep.
So obviously, social cognition of that type is not sufficient for collective intentionality.
Yes, yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, so thank you again.